So, yeah, so a couple of days ago, as we know, Terry Bollea, aka Hulk Hogan, passed away. And for a lot of us, including myself, that's a huge, big part of our childhood that we grew up on. And notably, a lot of wrestling promotions and even, I guess you could say industries outside of wrestling paid tribute, to Hogan. They did, Madison Square Garden lit up with a sign. I don't know if it was a sign they just made or because it looks like it's a sign that just hung on the side of Madison Square Garden, but obviously it's a screen, and it has a picture of Hogan after winning the WWE Championship for the first time, and and not just. But what I'm trying to say is, you have them doing that. You have the St. Louis Cardinals doing the intermission, not intermission, but the, switch from the bottom of the fourth, top of the fourth to the bottom of the fourth inning, if you will. The St. Louis Cardinals doing a tribute. You got, fans leaving flowers and everything outside of his beach shop, in Florida, and so on. And of course, you have a lot of promotions paying tribute to him as well, most notably WWE, but you also had TNA, MLW, New Japan, if you will, and among others. Except for one, well, at least at first they didn't, but, they did, but it still kind of paints them, and I'm not trying to be critical about this, because at least they did something, or at least one person on their side did something. Because at first, you had all these promotions on the day it happened, and even days after, doing dedications. They were putting up tributes. They were putting up in memorial or in memoir, if you will, or remembrance. They were putting all these up, and like I said, of course, WWE was doing it, TNA was doing it, MLW. New Japan. New Japan did a 10-bell salute for him before they started their show, just like WWE did as well. So you have all these promotions doing, these dedications in remembrance and in memorial and in memoir and all that, in memorial and in memoir, if you will. You having all of them do this. And even those that may not be on the same, outlet as the ones I've mentioned, but except there was one that, you would think would do it, but they didn't until tonight, and that was AEW. And for the past few days, AEW was coming under fire for that. Tony Schiavone, who's the lead announcer, or at least one of the lead announcers, he was coming under fire for what he had posted on social media. And credit to Schvonine, he corrected himself. He corrected himself and saying, "Look, he was a friend I got the privilege. The Hulkster was a friend I got the privilege to work with, because the way he worded it originally didn't sit well with a lot of folks. And TS, as you can call him for short, TS. He saw that. He saw the fact that obviously I didn't sound right there, or that didn't sound right, and he corrected himself. He corrected himself. But even after he corrected himself, AEW didn't put anything out, on social media. They didn't put in memorial or in memoir or, AEW remembers or in tribute or anything. They didn't put up anything. And it wasn't until tonight during Collision that Tony Schiavone on air paid tribute to Hogan. Because like he mentioned on social media, he worked with Hogan. And when you watch what Schiavone says, Schiavone actually did a good job paying tribute because of his personal experience with Hulk. But still, a lot of people will look at that like, yeah, you did a good job there, you did a make good, but, they're still going to put blame on AEW, mostly on Tony Khan. Now, Tony Khan had gone on record and said that Hogan and then later on his ex-wife Linda would never be part, you know, of AEW events ever because of, you know, what they have said and done, you know, personally, outside of who the character, you know, outside of the Hogan character, you know, so, you know, Tony Khan basically, you know, obviously is a man of his word on that, but still, it's like you have to realize that, you know, even though he said and did things outside of his character and outside of the business that, you know, as I've said before, he's been forgiven, you know, for by our good Lord above, by the good Lord above, he's been forgiven for already. Even though he's done stuff that in today's society would be, you know, in today's society is looked down upon, I should say, as, you know, it makes you a terrible person. You know, the thing is, people have to understand we all make mistakes. We all say and do things we don't actually, you know, realize that we're saying and doing until it's too late, and then it comes back to bite us. You know, it comes back to bite us. But what that shouldn't do is that shouldn't, you know, prevent us from celebrating the contributions that individual had in the genre that they, you know, were a part of. The sport that they were a part of. And Hogan is one of those individuals that whatever you think of Terry Bollea as the person behind Hogan, you know, outside the ring, Hulk Hogan as a character, as a mainstream star, if it wasn't for him, let's be honest, there would not be any wrestling today, or wrestling as we know it. There would not be any Monday Night Raw. There would not be any Friday Night SmackDown. There would not be any NXT. You know, when WCW was running things, you know, when you look at that, there would not have been no Nitro. There would not have been no Thunder, if you will. Heck, who knows how much longer WCW Saturday Night would have lasted, you know, if it wasn't for someone like Hogan putting wrestling on the mainstream map. And that's the truth. And when you think about that as well, if you're a promotion, you know, if you're a promotion as well, if it wasn't for Hogan putting wrestling on the mainstream map as we know it today, back then, back in 84, 85, you know, if it wasn't for him doing that, there would be no Game Changer Wrestling, GCW. There would be no Major League Wrestling, MLW. There would be no Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, TNA. Okay? There'd be none of that. There'd be no AAA to partner and kind of semi be owned by WWE. There would be none of that. You know, there would be no, there would be no New Japan as we know it today. There would be no New Japan as we know it that would birth rivalries like Okada and Omega and the Bucks and FTR and all that. There would not be any wrestling promotions as we know them today, or in existence as we know them today, if it wasn't for Hogan doing what he did. Hell, there wouldn't be no AEW All Elite Wrestling. Okay, there would not be All Elite Wrestling AEW if it wasn't for Hogan and what he, in his major contribution, I should say, to putting the wrestling media on the map. You know, and there's other promotions I can talk about as well. Rev Pro in England, you know, for a brief time, the the WCPW, if you will. There's them. Like I said, Game Changer Wrestling, the Hardcore Ultra Violence, CZW, the OG Ring of Honor, and the Tony Khan Ring of Honor. None of those would be around today if it wasn't for Hogan putting wrestling on the mainstream. There wouldn't be. There'd be no Billy Corgan buying the NWA name and trying to revitalize the NWA as it used to be. There wouldn't be none of that. There wouldn't be any wrestlers outside, once they leave the promotion they made a name for themselves and, or at least try to. There wouldn't be none of them trying to open up their own wrestling promotions or schools if it wasn't for what Hogan did. And people need to understand that. Again, you could judge the character behind Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, all you want, you know, for what he has said and done. But you cannot judge and not disagree or be against what he did for this business. Because, again, it wasn't for him, none of these promotions I've mentioned, including AEW, would be here today as we know them, or even in existence as we know them. All right, there'd be none of those. There wouldn't have been, an ECW to basically be the foundation, the originator for an ultra-violent wrestling promotion if it wasn't for Hogan putting wrestling on the map the way he did. They wouldn't be, ECW wouldn't be, like I said, in that position to inspire CZW in Game Changer Wrestling and all that. That wouldn't be none of that. Heck, there wouldn't be, believe it or not, if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan's contributions in the early to mid 80s. There wouldn't have been no Glow. There wouldn't have been no ladies of professional wrestling, or LPW, whatever it was, LPWA, Ladies Professional Wrestling Association. There'd be none of that. There wouldn't be no WOW, Women's of Wrestling, past and present, if it wasn't for what he did. And this is why people were upset with the fact that Tony Khan didn't see through his blindness of the fact that Hulk Hogan as a character, not the person behind it, but as a mainstream character, as a wrestling icon, this is why people got mad at Tony Khan, because he could not see through his blindness that if it wasn't for someone like Hulk Hogan, AEW would not have a platform as we know it today to be in existence. They wouldn't be. They wouldn't be. They wouldn't be, even, a thought in Tony Khan's mind. Tony Khan would be focusing more on, his family's, ownership of the Jaguars and the various soccer, teams, if you will, in the Premier League and so on. He wouldn't even give AEW a second thought, if you will. He wouldn't even consider that. Because you know why? Because there wouldn't be no previous Southern Wrestling-based promotion to, take inspiration from and try to fill that void with. There'd been none of that. And, and Tony Khan, was too blinded to see that. He was too blinded for a time to see that, and probably still is. Until I'll give credit, because I truly believe this is what happened. Tony Schiavone went to Tony Khan, told him, hey, or asked him, hey, or at least let him know, hey, I want to say something on behalf of Hogan. As someone that worked with him in WCW, let me say something. Let me say something. And Tony Khan probably said, sure. Because if there's one piece of credit people will give Tony Khan, is he will let his talents, either the in-ring performers or the announcers, say what they got to say and not face repercussion. Hopefully. Not face repercussion, hopefully. And Tony Schiavone probably talked to Tony Khan, said, I want to go out there, when I'm out there, or he probably told him, hey, during the show, I want to say something on behalf of Hogan. And Khan was like, fine, no problem, go ahead and do that. And maybe even Schvonine give him credit. Maybe he even said, look, if I don't say something, this is going to make the company look worse than what it is now because we didn't do any tribute. We didn't put any in memorial or in memoir or remembrance kind of, graphic on our social media page and all that. We didn't do any of that, because of your disdain for the man behind Hogan. So or something like that to extent, if you will. But I have a feeling Tony Schiavone probably convinced Tony Khan, hey, let me at least say something. And he did, and it was beautifully well done. Give Schiavone his credit, give him his flowers. I'm trying to find the right word. So when you think about it now, that the only person we'd have to put blame on, point the finger at, is the other Tony, because it took someone basically to go up to him and say, I'm going to say this because I worked with the guy, is that cool with you, to get the okay to do it. Like I said, to get the okay to do it. But even though Tony Schiavone, as I put it on social media, did this because he knew what he said in his social media post was wrong, but also to save face for himself and not just himself, but for the company as a whole, again, give the guy his credit, give him his flowers, and that the only Tony now people should be looking at with a bit of disdain and anger for not realizing that if it wasn't for someone like Hulk Hogan, he wouldn't have a business to have his company in, it's Tony Khan. Like I said, if there's anybody, you point the finger towards right now, it's Tony Khan. Because, like I said, he has to realize that if it wasn't for someone like Hogan putting this wrestling business on the mainstream map like he did, he wouldn't have a wrestling business as we know it today, to create and found AEW. He wouldn't have had that. And again, if you want to put any blame still towards All Elite Wrestling, and for them waiting to basically the middle of a show that no one really watches, no one really cares for, in Collision, to put out a dedication to Hulk Hogan. And it comes from a guy that worked with him, a guy that realized what he said on social media was wrong and corrected himself, and probably told Tony Khan, I want to say something, and Tony Khan gave him the okay, and he went out and did it. If you really still want to put the blame on anybody for AEW not acknowledging from the very beginning about what happened, if you want to still put the blame on anyone, it's got to be Tony Khan. Because this just shows you that the guy doesn't get it yet. He doesn't get it yet. That if you're going to be part of the wrestling business, you need to pay tribute to even those that may have not worked for you, and that behind their character may have done some things that a lot of people will look at as wrong. But you cannot deny the contributions as the characters they represented on television and what that character, did for the business. And that's what Hulk Hogan did. And Tony Khan needs to swallow his pride and go out there on social media, go out there on Dynamite, and acknowledge the contributions this man did. And acknowledge that if it wasn't for him putting wrestling on the map like he did back in the early to mid 80s, that there would not be a wrestling business today for AEW to exist in. So yeah, Tony, TK, he still has a lot to learn about the wrestling business, especially from this standpoint. But I will give props to Tony Schiavone for waking up, realizing what he said on social media was wrong, correcting himself, and being the one to basically, stand up and say, I want to say something in remembrance of this man, because I worked with him. So, so thumbs up to Tony Schiavone for doing that, for realizing the mistake he made on social media, taking responsibility for it, and then stepping up to the plate and doing what he did at Collision. So I'll give him credit there. But TK, Tony Khan, you still have to wake up and realize a lot of people make mistakes and say things that they shouldn't. I'm sure you're one of them. But it's also time for you to wake up and realize that if you're going to be part of this, you need to put those personal differences aside and focus on what the person, who portrayed the character, you have to focus on that character they portrayed and what that character brought to the wrestling business. That's what you need to do. But that's all I want to say, guys. Let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comment section, as well as during the live chat during the premiere. Like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel. Also, guys, click on the links in the description to find my content elsewhere outside of YouTube. We'd greatly appreciate it if you did. Also, check out my Teespring store for merchandise you can't get anywhere else. But give me your thoughts on this whole situation, and until next time, I am out.